is Annie and welcome back to my channel. So a while ago I ventured into cooking medieval foods by following recipes from manuscripts. And I really enjoyed that because it allowed me to get a glimpse into what people would have been eating in the medieval period. So I thought that this time I would do some baking, as I love baking, and medieval pies kind of fascinate me for some reason. As I was doing research on medieval desserts, I found that a lot of them used fruits because they have a natural sweetness, and sugar was expensive, so you would want to make use of any sweetness you could get. So I came across 3 different apple pie recipes that were very similar and looked like they'd been derived from each other. And one of these recipes belonged to our old friend, a form of curry, which was a manuscript written likely in 1380, and it was written by the head cook of King Richard II's kitchens. So I thought it'd be fun to make this kingly apple pie. Like a lot of medieval recipes, it is kind of vague, so we're gonna be doing some guesswork here, but I'm gonna talk through all the decisions I made and why. So the first thing the recipe asks for are, unsurprisingly, apples, but it specifies that they're good apples, so I hope that I picked some good apples. And then we run into our first problem, as the recipe calls for good spices. I just went with spices that I'd seen before in a lot of medieval recipes and that I thought would match well with the pie, and those were cinnamon, ginger, and nutmeg. So while spices were very expensive in the medieval period and were elite goods, I thought it would be fine to use these spices as this recipe was written for the court and the king himself. So I think that it would be safe to kind of guess that they would use nice spices. So the other ingredients the recipe asks for are figs, raisins, and pears. And then we run into our second instance of having to do some guesswork in this recipe because, like basically all the medieval recipes I've looked at, it doesn't specify any quantities. So I just had to guess and see what would go well. So I ended up using 4 apples, 2 pears, 5 figs, and a cup of raisins. Then I braid the figs and the raisins together, and I didn't really see how I could do that with the apples and the pears, so I just cut them up in small pieces. Then I mixed them all together, added the spices, and then I colored it with saffron, which is the one spice the recipe specifically asked for, and it's a common spice in a lot of medieval recipes. So though I looked for it in several supermarkets, I couldn't find saffron in its pure form. So that was what would have been used, and here's an image of it. But yeah, I couldn't find it, so we're gonna have to settle for the powdered. So now that we have our filling done, it's time to move on to the pastry. And again, we have a lot of room for interpretation, as the recipe just asks us to do it in a coffin. So a coffin was the term used for the encasing of the pie, and it was a very simple dough made out of usually flour and water that had the function to contain the filling and preserve it and help transport it. And a lot of times it wasn't consumed, and it had very thick walls that were simply meant for transportation and preservation. But the coffins were not always inedible, as there are a few recipes that specify how to make the coffin and sometimes refer to the encasing as a fair paste. And those are a bit more delicate, a bit thinner, and those would be consumed. So even though the recipes that I'm using simply tack on the put it in a coffin at the end of the recipe and don't specify what kind of pastry would be used, I thought it would be safe to assume that because these are sweet pies and more delicate, a nicer encasing would have been used for these pies. So in order to compromise, I went with a fair paste recipe that it's found in another manuscript from around 1450. It's a bit later than a form of curry, but the apple pie recipe also appears in 15th century manuscripts, so I thought it would be nice to pair that. Again, there are no measurements for this recipe, so I just went with 225 grams of flour, added a bit of salt, and then I added 150 milliliters of boiling water with saffron mixed in, and then I just combined it all in order to make a dough. And because there was no butter or eggs or anything that would usually be used in a pastry today, it really felt like bread dough but without any yeast. And at some point, I honestly just felt like I was in a technical challenge at the Great British Bake Off because I had to guess everything. So I rolled out the dough and I pre-baked it, as I had this feeling that the filling was gonna release a lot of liquid and I didn't want a soggy bottom. After pre-baking it, I put in the filling and added the lid, and adding the lid was also a decision of mine, and though the recipes are called apple tarts, tarts and pies were used interchangeably, and I just decided to make a full-on pie. Then I put it in the oven and it was done. So here we have our pie, and the part that worries me the most is the dough, because I think the filling, there's no really a way to go wrong with cinnamon and apples and raisins, so, but the dough is kind of different, so let's see how it worked out. It's really good. So the filling, as I expected, is really delicious, and even though there's no sugar, it's really sweet. The fruits really have that sweetness, and it doesn't need any more sugar, which is interesting because a lot of apple pie recipes today use a lot of sugar. So if you want a less sugary apple pie, I guess this is a good recipe. And the dough, I thought it would be really chewy and not good, but it feels very nice. It feels like, it doesn't feel like bread, but it doesn't feel like pastry. Yeah, I'm gonna eat more of this. So to wrap up, I'm really happy with my medieval apple pie. I'm very pleasantly surprised that the dough is edible and that it's yummy, and the filling is lovely even without any sugar. And I would recommend you try and bake this apple pie. It's not a very complex recipe. You don't need to cook anything, and it's very, comparatively, it's a very healthy apple pie because there's no butter and no sugar. It's just the fruits themselves doing most of the work. So if this is something that you'd like to see me do again, please let me know. I really enjoy cooking these recipes, and I'd love to make other things too. And I hope that you try and bake this pie. I'm gonna leave my interpretation of the recipe in the description, and let me know how it works out. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.